Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Stacey Jones from Salisbury University. I'm the Associate Director of Admissions, but more specifically, probably better named as the Communications Manager. So I'll be talking to you all today about creating and managing your communications with EMAS. We will work for, in this next, say, 45 minutes to get through the first kind of session, which is more of understanding EMAS communications overall and how they work at a high level in EMAS and what the capabilities are. So as we get started, I just wanted to make sure that everyone can see the screen, the Create and Manage Communications with EMAS screen before we get started. So anybody let me know if they can't see the screen, and otherwise we'll get started. Okay, so I think we're good. All right, so hold on. There it is. Okay, so our learning objectives, for the most part, what we'll be covering just today in this limited session is understanding EMAS communications capabilities, as I just said a few moments ago. EMAS communications. So really, just to kind of set the stage, there's a lot you can do with EMAS communications. I've been working with communications in EMAS almost nonstop, almost every day for almost 6 years now. So how I started and where I am now is really a broad spectrum. So I think a message, there's a lot of capability, there's a lot of features and functionality. You may not be able to use them all day one if you're getting started with communications, which I think most of my audience is, but know that it's a kind of evolution. It's going to grow and change over time. You'll learn lots of things, and things around us will be changing as well. So how the communications work is very nice when you understand that it's based entirely on the enrollment funnel. So talking about, the beginning of the process in purchasing names and loading them into EMAS, they're known as our 100s, to our inquiries, where they actually respond to us in some way and let us know that they're interested in our institution. Moving then down the funnel, as you see, it gets narrower. They apply to the decision, whether that be an admit or a deny, down to confirmed, meaning they've said they're going to actually attend your institution, and then enrolled when your system kind of matriculates them. So as you know, naturally that funnel goes down. But what is really nice about EMAS and its communication is that you can communicate at each stage of that enrollment funnel. Because what's really important is sending the right message to the right students at the right time. And I'll even make that broader and say market segment more in general, because I know we're talking now more about high school counselors and different market segments. And EMAS has a very clear and succinct way to talk to those students throughout the enrollment management funnel. So that's probably, for me, one of my favorite features is it's so easy to understand. It kind of has a business translation into the academic sector. So looking at this, EMAS enables you to coordinate all of your communications.
Hey, sorry.
Hi. We just got started a few minutes ago.
All right.
So we have, ways to talk to different populations. So, recruiter outreach, telecounseling outreach, text messaging. So over time, EMAS has evolved the application to really expand its offerings within the communication sector, with text messaging being the latest in that series. So that really gives us a lot of capability that you may not implement all in day one, but to know, going in that those capabilities are there, I think is nice. And talking once again to different markets that you have. So your undergrad versus your graduate market versus, if you want to, first generation students. Students that are likely to enroll, transfers. So it's very flexible in the fact that you can talk to multiple audiences in the way they want to be talked to, or segment them out, group them together in ways that make sense for your business. Because as you know, as different schools, we all do things slightly differently, but the flexibility is there with this tool to be able to do that. And on top of that, then you can track and monitor and report on all of your communications, whether you're writing queries, developing reports in Power Report Writer, running reports that EMAS provides right out of the box, or writing a simple query to see how well students progressed with the communication that you sent to them. So really the idea is to get you the right class or the ideal class at the end of the day each season. That's really what you're looking for, and EMAS has a good way to help do that, a lot of flexibility, a lot of options that we'll be talking about that will allow you to do that. So the foundation really, you have all of your possible students, in the system, but when you're looking at how you begin to talk to them specifically or communicate with them, it really comes down to 3 key fields all the time. And it's really even broader than that, in the sense that almost every query that you may write in EMAS would have at least these 3 things in it, and that would be the market segment. So whether you're talking about your freshman, your transfer, your international population, whatever those segments are for you, you will define that for communications, as well as the entry term. So, here at Salisbury, we can have fall and spring open at the same time, but we don't necessarily communicate the same way. So we have different communications for that. One's a spring entry term, one's a fall entry term, one for freshmen, one for transfer. So it begins to get complicated there. And then what stage, as we talked about that enrollment funnel, as we started out, what stage are they? Because that changes the message as they move and progress through the enrollment management funnel. So really keeping those 3 key fields in mind in a lot of things that you do, communicating, querying, lots of things, that's a key concept to understand in working with the communications and the capabilities in EMAS. So just to give some examples, and they could be different, for different institutions, so different market segments. So you've got your freshmen, transfers, returning students, first generation Latinos, high school grads. No matter how you need to segment out your populations, you can do that. These are just some examples, but really you can go as broad or as narrow the buckets of market segments that you need. So the tool's very flexible. If you need to communicate differently to a population, then that's most likely going to be a different market segment for you in EMAS. And then, of course, your entry terms. We talked about spring, fall. Some people have summer terms that they enroll in, especially grad programs and things like that. So that flexibility is there for the different entry terms. And, we all have our different conventions for entry terms. So that some may say spring 17, we say 2174, all kinds of different conventions. You can configure that to work with your academics business's rules. And then the stage. So once again, back to that enrollment funnel, all the way from a purchase name through an enrolled student. So really 6 different stages that we can communicate with students. So those 3 things, now seeing them visually, are really the foundation for communications in EMAS. Any questions at this point? We're just kind of covering some kind of background, how the tool's set up. Everybody with me?
Actually, I do have a question, and maybe you'll address this later.
Okay.
Can you talk about how you manage market segments for when you have a market segment for a subpopulation, specifically first generation or Latino, who will also need to receive the same mailings as, say, first-time freshmen?
Yeah, I guess what I would do, so when I see that personally, speaking from the rules in place here at Salisbury, I wouldn't necessarily make that a different market segment if all the communications are the same. They would just get it within, you know what I mean? I might have an indicator, like my ethnic origin, that they're Latino, but if nothing changes other than maybe I add a statement here or there, if it's, something specifically related to Latino within a communication, then I could use an if then else statement or an article in an email to put in a statement that maybe is more targeted to that population. It's really going to depend, I think, on how you need to communicate. But to me, if all the communications are the same and maybe there's a line or 2 different, or, in a couple of communications, we can probably handle that within the communications and not necessarily create a whole new market segment that would require a whole new communication plan. Does that answer your question?
Yep, thank you.
But we could talk about it more specifically if you wanted to sit down, and I could, with more information, probably if we mapped it out, I could give, an even more specific answer depending on what you want, what your specific needs were.
Right, okay, thank you.
Okay, so within EMAS, there's 3 ways that we can assign or send those communications. And the first way is individual communications. It's very simple. So you can literally pull up or search a student record, open up their communication student plan, and assign a communication to them, whether that be a letter, a mailing label, an email, a text message, a telecounseling call. You can just individually do it for a student on the fly. So go right in. So for example, I may do this. Someone will call in to Salisbury and say, I didn't get my admit letter. So we pull up the student, we look in their contact history, and we see that we sent one, okay, maybe 2-3 weeks ago. They're saying they didn't get it. We verify the address. They say it's correct. I will pull up that student record, assign another admit letter, and I will send that letter to the student. So that's an example of sending in an individual communication through EMAS. So that's really option 1, pretty simple. But that's really on an individual kind of basis, or just a handful of students that you want to send something to. That would be the route I can do it. And we do that on a day-to-day basis for certain things, communications that we have, letters, emails, things like that. Okay. The second way is to write a query, or in EMAS you'll actually see it is called Select Target Group under Communications, and you will define a population through a query that you want to send a letter, an email, assign a telecounseling call to. You can do any of those things through the Select Target Group, which allows you to define a query and assign a communication or many communications to that population, the results of that query. So, and we do target communications probably almost every day of the week as well. Okay. And the third way is your standard communication plans. And this is where you create communications for the market segment, the stage, and I'm going to forget the third one. Why? Sorry. The market segment, the stage, and the entry term, excuse me. And you have communications that are set up and predefined that you turn on, so that when the student hits that stage, market segment, and entry term, they are automatically in their plan assigned a series of communications that you have defined in that plan, and the timeline is pre-established and set. So the minute someone, for example, submits their application to Salisbury University, my 300 level or application communication plan is assigned to their student plan with all the communications there and the dates that they are intended to go out to that student. And that would be true for anyone at that meets that criteria, that's in that market segment at that stage for that entry term. Now that's the big one. That's the kind of more complicated, the most robust that we have for the communication options. So that's probably a lot to tackle. We'll have to look at that and break that down a little more. But once you have it set up, you know, setting it up the first time is the most difficult part. But after you have it set up, there's surely a clear pathway to keep that updated and roll those plans forward, entry term to entry term. Okay, so for example, at Salisbury, we have for sophomores in high school, we have a plan. For juniors in high school, we have a plan. For those seniors that are now applying to Salisbury, we have a plan. Transfers, then international freshmen, international transfer. And then we have one called SU Bridges, a much smaller plan, but nonetheless, we run those plans every year and for every semester. Okay, so moving on. All right, so some examples of these communications under these 3 main ways that you can communicate in EMAS. So individual communications, so congratulate an athlete. Maybe you saw them play in a game and they're being recruited here, and you just want to send them a note that you just watched their game, or what a great job, or 13 points, 12 rebounds, whatever it might have been. You can do that kind of on the fly individual communication to that student. And in fact, one of the nice features about EMAS for that personalization is that you can pull up the student record, click the email button, and you can write an email just like out of Outlook and send to the student. So it's not always has to be an HTML, for example, based email or anything as elaborate as that, but you have the opportunity to send those, and they're tracked in the communication history in EMAS. And you can also send like a unique follow-up note to a student at a high school visit. So maybe you made a connection a strong connection, you want to send an email to them, or you have a letter that you send after a visit, you could go in and assign that student that communication and you have it sent to that student. So then on that select target group, once again, we're talking about building queries. You could write a query in the first instance of all students who are eligible for scholarship for that entry term, for that market segment and stage, and send them a communication about, say, scholarships. You know, maybe a deadline's approaching and you want to make sure, you know, they submit an application. Or follow up with students that came to a high school visit or a college fair. So, you know, perhaps you have an attendance flag, or you mark that they attended, so you can create a query for all the students that attended that event and send them an email or a letter or a follow-up postcard, whichever is, you know, your practice. And then other time-sensitive and high level of control communications. So, for example, we had an open house last weekend. So on Monday evening, we call all the students that have registered and remind them to attend. So we select target group for everyone who's RSVP'd to the event, and we assign a telecounseling call that our telecounselors will call and confirm the open house attendance for that Saturday event. In addition, we use that same query to send them an email confirmation with the last minute details about the event. So that's a perfect example of selecting a target group and sending two different communications very easily to students that are very timely, meaning for last Saturday, to help ensure attendance at an event. And then our standard communications, you send planned items when a student moves to a new stage. So as we said, we load an application into the system that takes the student and either enters them as a 300 or applicant level record for the first time in EMAS, or they were already a record at the 100 or 200 level, and that application made them a 300. So what that will immediately do is, as I said before, assign a 300 level communication plan to them, in which case for us, the first communication in that plan is an application acknowledgement letter that gives them access to their GoMed account, which is their student portal here, so that they can track the status of their application. And then also the same thing, when you admit a student, the first thing that's going to come out once that admit hits is the 400 level communication plan, and for that it's the decision letter. So if they've been admitted, an admit letter will be generated. So you don't have to think about it, you don't have to write a query for it, you can set that up, and I sort of say it kind of tongue in cheek, set it and forget it, and know that those admit letters are going to go out, or deny letters, in which case those are canceled communications, which will be the deny letter will most likely be the only communication that goes out to that student. And then the communication plan ends for them because they're canceled. Okay, any questions at this point? Okay, I'm going to move on. Okay, so there's a lot of planning that goes into the process of getting kind of communication started. It can be like sort of an elephant in the room, and it can seem rather intimidating, and making that decision point of whether something is really on a communication plan or whether something is in you know, a select target group or sent targeted, as we say here. So kind of the way that EMAS likes to think about that is kind of two ways. And the first way is that calendar-based communications would typically be used as select target group. Another good way to think about that are time-sensitive communications. Okay, so for example, that open house confirmation and the open house telecounseling call is very time-specific, on a certain date. Okay, that's very, not impossible, but more difficult to plan to go out correctly on a standard plan. So most people would make the decision to send that targeted. So I think a good way to kind of as an initial assessment of making that determination is to think about time sensitivity of an event. So orientation might be orientation confirmations might be another example, but one that I could probably make work on the plan would be the orientation invite. Okay, that I can most likely put on my plan with just a little bit of manipulation and make that work. So your standard plan items that would go on your communication plans are more like the admit letter, the deny letter we talked about, an invite to visit at that particular stage of the plan. So at this case, we're talking about the admit stage, a congratulations letter from the president, information about upcoming events, next steps for the student, reminding them to deposit. You can set up a tracking communication for that to just remind them of that May 1, ticker, as long as they're don't have an earlier date like our transfers do. So anyways, there's just some careful thought and planning, but a good kind of line in the sand is to think about time sensitivity or calendar-based communications versus things that kind of can just roll on a schedule. Okay, so many days out and just kind of keep communicating. Don't really need a lot of rules or structure around them. We just want to make sure we stay in contact with the student. Okay, so examples of that calendar-based communications where you may use that select target group. High school visit invitations, very time sensitive, right? You've got all your counselors scheduling visits. They're at different times of the day and multiple days, so lots of things there and complexity around high school visits that would make them more probably appropriate for a select target group than perhaps onto a plan. Application deadline reminders, I think you could make them work for a plan. A lot of people, at least in the initial stages of getting their hands around communication management in EMAS, would probably look at those for targeted as well. Campus visit invitations, admit letters, okay. Orientation invitations. So lots of things, financial aid deadline reminders. So anything with a specific deadline, okay, like March 1st or February 1st, are most likely, at least in the initial, good candidates for the select target group. And any other personalized messages. How it's kind of evolved at Salisbury is we're always trying to look at our data and make decisions and look at what's going on to see if there are opportunities to communicate and take advantage of things that we see. So when that happens, that is usually targeted communication for me, is just opportunities, additional opportunities that will this make them budge? Will this make a difference? And usually when I do those, though, I also look for ways to track to see if it actually worked or not. So that's always something to keep in mind is select target group usually gives you a good opportunity to follow through and report specifically that it may have moved the needle. It may have gotten kids to commit to your institution. We have a few more of the high schools. Okay, we'll let those show. All right. So action-based communications on the standard plan. So if we look at that, we could have a letter, for example, go out day 0. So the day that the student joins that stage, that market segment, and that entry term, we could have a letter go out. So back to my kind of example that we've already talked about is this is perfect for a 300 level student who just applied to Salisbury and they get their application acknowledgement letter day 1 or day 0, okay, the day that they join that composition in EMAS. On the same day, we can send an email to them, okay, and that email for us would be a counselor intro email from their counselor after application. So thanking them for their application, picture of the counselors in there, just trying to establish that connection, put a name to a face now that they've actually applied to Salisbury. Okay, so, and then we can also assign a phone call so that the recruiter calls and congratulates them for applying to Salisbury University. We'll know whether they visited yet or not, can encourage a visit and things like that. And then an application packet could go out on the standard plan about 2 weeks from that phone call. So you can make that automatically appear in Generate Mail and be available for your processor to process. And then a second phone call could be easily scheduled 2 weeks from call 2. So this is more of what that flow of that communication plan looks like rather than selecting a target communication or a target query and sending to a population. This can all be planned out. It applies to most likely everyone that meets that criteria. You can, like I said, set it and sort of forget it, and as long as your processor's working, everything will go out the way it's supposed to go. So, and you can, design these based on the way that your business process works. This may not be the communications that you send, but it doesn't matter what those communications are. It's what works for your office and how you communicate with your students. So it doesn't matter what it is. It's just that you have the capability to schedule things to go out, the types of pieces you want to go out, when you want them to go out, when a student joins that plan. Okay. All right, so another thing that's kind of important with communications that you have to keep in mind is naming them. So they're used to assign the communications to students and plans. So really, when you create communications, we always name them first, and then we put a document or an email or a type of format with them, but they have a name. So there's, over time, best practices that evolve in the naming of those communications, and it's really also going to depend on your market. So, for example, for us, we have a lot of repeat business of transfers who don't quite get here the first time or maybe even the second time, as well as freshmen who were somewhere in our enrollment management funnel, didn't come to Salisbury as freshmen, but come back to us as transfers later. So with that said, with the repeat business, that dictates a specific way that we name our communications for students. Also, the way we build our communication plan does that as well. So for us, you want to be very clear about your naming convention. You want to adopt one and you want to stick with it. So I'll speak to Salisbury. What works for us is we always name ours with our entry term, and then our market segment, and then a descriptive name of the communication. So for example, 2188 is our fall 2018 entry term. Our market segment for freshmen is FTS, so it's 2188 FTS, and then we'll say app acknowledgement letter. So that's the name. Similarly for transfer, 2188 TRN app acknowledgement letter. Okay, so so because of repeat business for us, a business reality for us, of transfers coming back and back, using transfer app ack letter without a term would not work for us, because they only get it the first term that they ever applied for us, and they would never get it again. So we include the entry term, which means if they apply again for spring 2019 2194, okay, they got the 2188 TRN app acknowledgement letter, but they will also now get the 2194 transfer app acknowledgement letter if they apply again. So that was a big consideration for us that made us include entry term, because we have so much repeat business. General names, even though they be descriptive and they have the market segment, the student won't get it because the entry term isn't there. There's no distinguishing factor in that communication. Now that's kind of a big concept. Does everyone understand that issue? And you may not have that issue at your institution, but we did. So that is why we evolved. So part of this is understanding your requirements and your business and adapting and creating a naming convention that will work for your institution.
Stacey, do you ever archive those comm names that are old or anything like that, or do you archive them when you archive old data, or do you just let them roll?
Well, they do get unmanageable. So opening our document repository in EMAS can get very ugly. You can imagine how many documents we have, right? Because if you delete it, you're no longer going to see it in the student record, right? So we are still carrying data from 2015 forward still. Now I am thinking about dumping some of that, but I have gone through though and deleted old communication names out of documents. But I've kept ones, like say there was a document that we used, like a targeted communication from 2015. We don't use it now, but we may use it in the future. So if that's something unique that doesn't exist in every plan following it, I'll keep that one, just so if we ever say, hey, remember that thing we did back, a few years ago, and it's just different and not carried forward. I kind of keep unique entities out there, but then get rid of like the old app acknowledgement letter. I don't care. It's basically the same. There's minor changes to it over time, but stuff that was kind of targeted and specific that we didn't continue, but we may continue again, I keep, so I don't have to recreate the wheel. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think so. Thank you.
Yes, but it takes a while to delete those out. So it's actually, I put a student on that every once in a while when I want to clean things up a bit. So it takes some time to, I'm sure we could do it programmatically, but you can also do it functionally for those people who are just getting started.
Yeah.
Okay. So that's really what it comes down to. The benefit of building communication plans in EMAS is to plan. Like the planning is so important. Plan strategically, build it once, and then you'll refine and reuse it annually. And that is exactly what I do with my communication plans. I have a whole documented process, and actually we're starting it now for 2019, for spring, of building those, carrying those plans forward. So that's an endeavor starting right now, and we put a pretty good process in place to roll those plans forward, make the necessary edits to them. And I must say, when we talk about naming conventions, this comes back into play again. When you are renaming them and giving them the current term, that kind of gives you some trackability and auditability and editability of knowing where you are. So when they rename them and they copy them forward and they print them out, that is our kind of basis for making edits for the upcoming term. It is a paper trail for us at this point, but it works for us because I have multiple students that are working on this. They're in different hours. They're not full-time, as you guys know. So it really just, they're in folders for the particular stage for that market segment and for that entry term. So the 2198-300 freshman plan is in a folder with all the documents printed out for edits, so that my students can make changes. And we also, just a best practice, print everything out drafts. So as changes get marked, we never leave that on top. It's always a clean draft on top, so we know the change has been made. And just with all the craziness of using students and graduate assistants to help with communication plans, that's just something that helps me have sanity. So if I ever look at a document that has writing on it, meaning edits, then I know it hasn't been made, because I should never look at a top copy that has edits on it. That means it hasn't been done yet. It always should be clean. So it's just a way with people walking in and out for us to keep track of things. But it's so true that you can reuse it as a good starting point. You're not recreating the wheel. You have a basis and a foundation to get started, and then move forward. And not that there aren't new communication ideas or ideas that don't get retired, but looking at it all the way it was in the last term is definitely a way to get you back on that page and get you started. Okay, so one of the ways to get started is to kind of use we've developed a worksheet, which we'll be working on later in this class, to kind of help you get some key considerations in print and down for you to start to plan your communications. So really, what is your current context? What are you coming into this with? Are you bringing in something that hasn't been formalized, but obviously you have communications? Everyone has an admissions office that has to communicate with students. What are you coming into this exercise with, right? What is your ground zero, which is never going to be nothing. So understanding what you're bringing into the process, and what those communications are that you already have in place, and not that won't change and evolve or be tweaked, but at least gives you some grassroots, something and a foundation to start to work with. And once again, very importantly, before we get too far down the process in EMAS with the communication plans, is making a determination for your rules and how you do business of what your naming convention should be. Do you need to have your entry term in yours? Do you have a situation similar to mine, where you have repeat business, and if you didn't differentiate those comms, they'd only get them once? Okay, so those kinds of things need to be talked out and flushed out and adopted, and then obviously stuck to. So naming conventions is really at the beginning of the conversation as well. Okay, and then, getting started with this process, we talk about freshmen, we talk about transfers, we talk about counselors, we talk about lots of things, and it can get really easy to grow the web and get confused and feel overwhelmed by the process you're undertaking. But really the best practice and the best way to get started is to pick one student market segment, right? Whether that be your freshman or your transfer, whichever one is most pressing for you or would feel like a good accomplishment to get kind of knocked under your belt. So, for us, that would be freshmen. That's 95% of our population. So, and deciding, what types of communications, so kind of categorically assigning and classifying the communications that you're bringing to the table, right? Are they one-on-one communications, so you just one-off assign them? Are they event-based, or time-sensitive, in which case select target group, or help me understand how I could potentially put that on my communication plan, okay, even if it is time-sensitive. Or it is a candidate for the communication plans, our app acknowledgement letters, our admit letters, things like that, letters to parents, congratulations from the president, things that are just standard communications, most likely going to most of your student population, that can be set up and then just run. So really looking at what you have and making a determination initially of which category they fall into will help. And then, of course, we can have a discussion about any opportunities there or any concerns. Using the days at stage benchmarks report as your guide, right? So knowing how long a student is in the application phase of the enrollment management funnel. So perhaps, you know, the app opens August 1st, you get a bunch of applications at that point, but it takes them a long time to complete. So on average, perhaps a student is in the 300 level stage for maybe 42 days. I'm just pulling that out for now. It may be less, it may be more, it'll be different by the institution and the way that your business works. But then perhaps you want your communications to be spread out to cover that average time span, okay? And even if kids move through quickly, are there comms in that 300 level plan that if they didn't get because they moved through quickly, that you would put on the 400 level plan, the admit plan, that they could still get because they're still important, the message is still relevant, and you want to make sure the student gets it. So these are all kinds of considerations that you have about how to lay out those communications, whether communications can appear on multiple stages of your communication plan. So our invite to visit is on every stage as long as they haven't visited already. So I have an invite to visit inquiry, invite to visit prospect, invite to visit applicant, invite to visit admit, if their visit flag is set to no still. I don't keep hounding them to visit if they've already visited campus. But that is kind of the things that you're thinking about and starting to take down kind of a layer of the onion in planning your communications. Okay, and then an even more general question is, you know, what do you think's needed? Knowing all the capability that EMAS has, maybe something, you have a short email that tomorrow you think would be better served as a text once the student's admitted. Maybe you feel like you're very email heavy, so maybe that should be scheduled as a text. It's a short, brief statement. You think it would be successful that way. Usually at the admit stage, it's a lot easier to text them and they'll respond. So you have those opportunities as well with the kind of features and functionality that EMAS provides with their communications. Okay. Any questions here?
So the days at stage, Stacey, can I set a communication to go out on a certain date?
No, not on the communication plan. You can work around that, Cody, in setting it up as time sensitive, like I kind of alluded to. It's sort of an advanced communication tactic, but we use it. So for example, if I want on April 1st a deposit deadline reminder to go out, I create my email communication 2188 FTS time sensitive on April 1st FTS deposit deadline reminder. I put it in my time sensitive generate mail folder. Mary checks that every day and reads the instructions in the title. So when it says time sensitive, send April 1st, she's going to send it on April 1st. Does that make sense? So there's a way to work around it. It's sort of an advanced concept. I wouldn't start out doing this with beginning communication plan users, but as you get time under your belt, there is a way you can send them. But also the thing to remember though is that there's a system parameter that has to be set differently for that to be the case. So that days hist 0 needs to be set to yes, and that's how we have it set. Because otherwise it won't send out the next communication until the communication that precedes it goes out. So that just would have to remember to change the system parameter.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yes, ma'am.
And we can talk more about that at the break if you'd like.
Okay.
Okay. Okay. All right, so what communications need to be included in the next stage? So we talked about this, right? So maybe they go through too quick. You wanted them to get some communications, but they moved through 300, but they're still applicable once they've been admitted. You know, that key consideration, right? You want to keep communicating with them, especially if they're messages that are important, even though they're not at that stage. If they sort of have messages that span the ages, okay, you can do that. So we have some postcards that we have developed that we generate mailing labels for that appear not only on the 100, but the 200 and the 300 level plan to make sure, okay, because those messages are sort of universal, that the student gets it at some point, right? We have purchase names, they'll get it. If we didn't get it till they just raised their hand to visit, they'll get it, but they weren't a purchase name. And then if the first way, initial source code is application, that message is still valid, I send it at the 300 level if they haven't already received it. So those are definitely key considerations when you are mapping out communications, is looking at opportunities to make sure students get messages that are of more of a universal type of message. Doesn't really matter where they are in the funnel, you just want to make sure they get it. So that's really a key consideration. And you also, you know, we've talked a lot about everybody at that stage can get that, but EMAS has more capability than that. You have the ability to go after a more specific or personalized research within the communication themselves, as well as the way you set up your communication plan. So you can decide on the communication, in the communication plan, for example, if you want to send your scholarship award letter. So for us, we capture that amount, the scholarship amount for the letter, and if that field in EMAS, which is a user-defined field, is greater than 0, then send the letter. And by the way, bring that merge field of that amount into the letter. So that's how we handle our scholarship letter. Does everybody get a scholarship letter? No. Plenty of students have 0 in that scholarship amount field. If it's 0, the letter still stays available to them on the plan. Should they meet the logic criteria of having an amount greater than 0, then that initial scholarship letter will go out to them. So there is, you know, flexibility in, it's not an all or nothing type of communication plan. There are different techniques you can use with your audience to ensure that you can kind of target within those populations. That initial scholarship letter is an example of that logic on the communication in the communication plan. And we'll look at that later. And also, you can have variables in your letter. So one version of that, for example, and there's multiple ways to do this as well, but right now we're still in a kind of an earlier stage of this, and this is our counselor intro letter for us, is a variable letter. So based on who the counselor is, okay, so if the counselor is Heather, it gets Heather's counselor intro. If the counselor is Charles, it gets Charles's letter. So the variable is the counselor, which you can define, and depending on who the counselor is a different version of the email that's personalized from that counselor, has their picture, has their name. But I also know there's other ways to do that as well. You can use something called articles in emails, which will achieve the same thing. But right now we're using variables still for that. We haven't evolved to articles, but like, again, just showing the flexibility. So if you're kind of less advanced, you can use variables and they work. If you're kind of spiffy and good and on top of the kind of more current trends, articles are really the way to go. But the flexibility is there. It will work either way. And then also, here's kind of the kind of really fun thing, the if then else statements. So for example, my admit letter, typically mailed to a student, is 3 pages. It has the first page is really a letter admitting them to the university. The second page is next steps, and the third page is acceptance instructions. But if I go into my Word document in EMAS and I hit a little button called Alt F9, the document grows to 11 pages. And that is because of if then else statements or logic embedded within Word in the admit letter that contains different information for students in gated programs or in our nursing program. So programs that have some custom language related to the admission to the university, I have very complex if then else statements that bring in those custom messages based primarily on the major. So like I said, you can do that quite on steroids. So that 3-page letter easily goes to 11 when you look at the different if then else statements. So instead of having to have different versions of my admit letter based on content or, you know, major specifics, I can build them all into a letter with if then else statements. So that is a class in and to itself, that the nature of that. And there is some upper limitations on that, but we haven't hit on that yet, so we're still good. But lots of capability to be flexible. But at the same time, let me just say that our admit letter is also a variable letter. We have early decision is one version of the letter, early action is another version of the letter, regular decision is another. Conditional admit is yet another. So that's a variable letter that has a lot of if then else logic within it to make sure we're speaking to students the way that we need to be speaking to them. So a lot of capability with EMAS to kind of custom and tailor and personalize your outreach and your communications with your students. Okay. I think, let's see where we are on time. It's 4:04. Do you think we can stop here, Anna? And give some time for feedback before I have to go? Is she there?
Sorry, I was on 2 mute. Can you hear me?
Now
Yeah.
I can.
Okay. Sure, Stacey. I think to be able to give time for feedback is a lot of information, and it's a good time, I think, for us to stop.
Okay.
Stacey, out of curiosity, how much did you have left to do?
Let's see. Hold on. 1, 2, 3, 4. Like 5. 5.
And is this supposed to be an hour-long training session, or is it, I mean, just for timing purposes, or is it kind of whatever we decide how long it takes?
Right. Well, no, they planned it in the learning kind of thing that this piece would take 60 minutes.
Okay.
But this is part of a much longer training session. So I've just kind of spliced out a section as Sarah instructed me, because there's no way, we're not going to go through 8 hours of this.
Right.
So I kind of picked that introduction block to get started.
This is really good information. It's just a lot for a new
Yeah.
user.
It is. I know.
Is it supposed to be
I
targeted?
was overwhelmed.
Because it seems.
Sarah? Really? Okay. Fair enough.
Yeah, I'm not. I didn't mean to criticize.
Oh no.
And
no,
I don't
didn't-
do communication.
Yeah, I live this, so I need to hear. You know what I mean?
I don't. I don't do any
any-
of this.
Any insult from that at all. I just was, I live it every day, so it's different for me, I think.
So this is the actual training, like we would sit in a room with them and go over this for an hour?
Yes. Well, the way it's planned now, so that's what I did. I started with what they have, I guess, and I don't know the history of this, if this has ever been delivered. I don't know if Anna can chime in there if she knows.
Yes. So the PowerPoint slides that you're sharing, some of them are new. Some of them are pulled from different sessions that we have done. So our training materials are evolving. They're not static, and they can be changed, right? So based on what is determined is going to be effective, and also what you have to offer. So I think a bunch of notes, Stacey, about things where I feel like the PowerPoint could have served you better.
Mm-hmm. And I didn't have as much time as I would have liked to tend to this, unfortunately. You know what I mean?
Understood.
No, I mean, Stacey,
Understood.
great. I mean, it's just a lot of talking heads.
Yeah.
You're going to lose people.
Right. I agree. Too. Yes.
There's no hands-on. There's no demonstration. And I understand you got to get the bases down.
Yep. But it might be too much
Yeah.
getting into it. Mm-hmm.
But if she's doing a webinar, it pretty much has to be this. You can't. How would you make that a hands-on experience?
Yeah, I know.
Mm-hmm.
And if it's a training, somebody's paying to learn some things, then and you're starting from scratch, and I don't know if that's what everybody's going to be, and
Right.
and maybe that's it. Maybe whoever this is going to go toward needs to be tailored for them.
Right. No, and
Well,
I think this is ground zero. You know nothing, right? And so based on someone saying they want this training, I think we would assess where they are, and then we would slice and dice.
Agree. And I would assume, I mean, we're old hat, so we didn't really interrupt with money questions.
Right.
But I assume somebody's going to ask a question, you'll kind of figure out, oh, I see where you're at with this, and then adjust accordingly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But that's just that much less material you're actually going to get through at the end of the day, because you're having to answer questions along the way.
Right.
I think one of the things that you'll find when we sell a training, we try to do a little needs assessment, during the sales process of what is it that you need to be trained on and what are you starting with. And we would also know whether or not this is a brand new EMAS client or whether this is a new user coming into an experienced EMAS environment where they already have comp plans set up and they're just needing to understand what EMAS is already set up to do, or whether they have to actually do this from scratch. So all of that would be communicated prior. And
Yep.
Stacey, I think you did a fantastic job of covering everything possible. And I think that what's going to be helpful is when there's a real scenario, and this may be something that we want to look at for how I mean, this is what happens when you go first, right? Like we learn, okay, wait, what do we need to know? What do we maybe need to start with as an assumed scenario for the next person who's going to do the session?
Right.
So, should we provide you with a scenario? Okay, this is for a new user at an experienced client where they already have stuff set up.
Right.
Or, do you need to know, are these counselors, are these EMAS administrators? What would be helpful for you to know to be able to shape that? And one of the things that I was taking notes about had to do with that, right? Like if the audience is this, then this is too much. And if the audience is that, then this is perfect, right? Like, so it's very dependent on the audience. And when we're talking about an individual institution, while it could be a mix, there's usually somebody in there that needs to be the key person who walks away with the new information and, or the key people. So I thought that it was a good chance for me to take another look at our, our canned slides. But there were moments when I really wished that we could have broken away from the PowerPoint and gone into an EMAS. Right. Or gone into a screenshot or an Excel file of the worksheet. So when we were talking about naming conventions, before you got to naming conventions, and this isn't, again, because this was the PowerPoint slide deck that we gave you, so I get it. But I was just listening and thinking, okay, when you were talking about
our scenario,
when you were talking about phone calls and emails and letters and that they are term specific, or they might be assigned on a target group, or they might be assigned on a plan. Mm-hmm. And we now have a planning worksheet. So when you got to the part about planning, where they would be listing out each one of their communications and indicating whether this is a targeted item or a planned item and who the audience is and what the timing is. So right. If it's interval, like the timing is that it goes during the inquiry before they've applied, or the timing is it goes on November 15th, right? So, so that was one thing that I thought that might be helpful to show the actual worksheet.
Right. Well,
which we could.
I went out and looked and I couldn't find it. I didn't know if it was out there or not.
It is, but it's not filled in, right? So it only has one.
Find it all.
So it would be nice for us to get one that's either mocked up or get a real one that somebody's willing to share. So we can take that on. And I know you have like only 2 minutes left. So the other thing I wanted to share was on some of the questions that you got. So, which weren't very many, but when Cody asked days at stage. So what's interesting is that days at stage is one of the Kaleidoscope dashboards. And the opportunity not to see specifically, but to look at trends, like in general, our population is at the inquiry stage anywhere between 2 and 40 days. Then then you can start to think about, okay, what's the student's experience going to be like if they're only in inquiry for 2 days before they apply or for 40 days before they apply? And then, the long shots where it's, they're going to be in inquiry for a year, right? So that days at stage is referring to a dashboard that they can use to get a sense of how many days should I even think about? Like if their plan only has 3 items in it, they need to think about what happens after that time has passed and nothing goes out to that student, right?
Right.
Unless they're in target group. So that was one thing that is probably not in your daily activities that you're thinking about. And then the other one was when you mentioned days at stage and Cody asked the question, can I set it up for a specific date? And I think that's actually the point, is that the plans are about days at stage. They're not about a specific date. So if I've been an inquiry for 15 days, I'm going to get something whether I inquired in December or I inquired in September or I inquired in July. So that number of days I'm at the stage is not tied to a date. And so, but your answer was fantastic because you talked about that opportunity for the
naming them differently and putting them in a special folder.
Yeah,
and that's what
absolutely.
we do.
So one of the things that I really appreciated about how you shared your story was that you emphasized opportunities that the data presents to do new things, and you emphasized when you do that opportunities to find out if it worked.
Right.
If it made a difference to those students that you targeted. And so I thought that was fantastic. I agree. I think it's a lot. And I think when we're talking about an overview, there was a lot of stuff that you shared that could have been in an advanced session.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that we can provide some look at how to break this down into a beginner overview. And then now let's play around with the beginner stuff, right? So then we have a hands-on session and then an intermediate overview, and let's play around with the intermediate stuff. So for example, not worrying about logic and variables in the very first session. And I think this has been a challenge with our conferences. This is a conference session and how do you make the advanced people feel served and the beginning people feel served in the same 60 minutes? It's really challenging. So I think we have an opportunity to break it up.
I agree.
Stacey has to go.
Yep.
And so I'm sorry I talked too long. Who else, anybody else want to have feedback for Stacey at the moment?
Thanks for going first, setting the bar.
Yeah, it was really good.
Yeah,
That was, learned a lot there.
Yeah, no, I mean, I like it. Like I said, like Anna, I would love that. Like if I were to do this somewhere, I want to understand who they are, where they are. I would want them to walk out of training where we've done some significant work with something they wanted to do. Like we said, hardly anybody will have nothing. Right, they'll have some things that they send to applicants or whatever that we could come out of there with a comp plan. Like I feel confident enough if we asked the right questions, we understood what they were looking for, that I could do that. You know, in that training, they learn and they get something out of it at the same time. You know, now I don't know if that's what you guys envision or not, but that's more like this was just wide open, you know, delivering content, you know, I don't know.
Because Anna, these aren't designed to be webinars for like multiple people to join in on. These are like specific training opportunities for individual schools, right?
They're both. So
both.
We do offer webinars. So you notice we do like a year-end processing webinar every year. We do a telecounseling webinar every now and then.
But not for something as complicated as communications, just a whole broad topic.
I think we wouldn't try to stick it all into an hour, but that one is something that we would design probably as a beginner. And when we have individual clients that buy 16 hours worth of training, then we design the communication piece of it based on what they're starting from. So absolutely, it's designed for, you know, where do they need, does their plan, is it just a big disaster and they need to have, you know, consulting on how to make it better? Or is it that they just need to know how to do it? So, you know, there's all kinds of different starting points there could be. I want to let Stacey go because she, for 2 minutes over her hard stop. Stacey, thank you very much for going first. I echo that. And this recording will be available for all of you. And we will also, I'll share the notes I took around. And if others, if you have feedback that you didn't have time to share this afternoon, if you want to go ahead and email it, you can email it directly to Stacey or you can email it to me and I'll post it with the total.
Anna, is there anything following this first example that you would like us to do differently or that we can, you know, any direction that we should take or anything that you forgot to tell Stacey in the first one that you know, thought of that you want to tell the rest of us or as we go and run our own?
Possibly, but I will wait for Sarah on that. Sarah's back in the office on Thursday, and so you'll be hearing from us on Thursday. Or,
okay.
I don't know about Thursday, but you'll be hearing from us as soon as Sarah's able to get back in and check this out.
Great.
All right. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, guys. Have a great day.
Thank you.
Bye.
Good
Bye.
one.
Thanks, everybody.